Makes Me Wanna Holler by Nathan McCall, Chapter 19, Homecoming. Although I resisted the idea of marriage when I was on the street, near the end of my 6-month stint in the Norfolk Jail, I was eager to take vows with Liz. I came up with a lot of reasons to justify wanting to do it, but the bottom line was, on some level, I wanted to make sure she stayed around and help me do my time. Prisoners often cling to anybody they think can help ease the pain of doing time. It gives them a greater sense of security knowing that somebody has vowed to suffer through that hell with them. I saw dudes in prison claim to fall madly in love with the old woman friends they didn't look at twice on the streets. A woman could be cross-eyed, knock-kneed, and pigeon-toed and have the IQ of a brick, but to a dude who's been locked up a long time, she's a thing of beauty and a treasure, sure enough. When I raised the idea of marriage to Liz in a letter, she eagerly agreed. She wanted to get married before then. We'd gotten as far as the parking lot leading to the Justice of the Peace office once, then I made up some lame excuse to back out, leaving her in tears. Liz and I got our blood tests and were moving forward with the planned jailhouse wedding ceremony when something unexpected happened. One fall morning in October, a week or so before the wedding date, a guard came to the cell block entrance and shouted, "McCall, pack your bags." It was my day to be shipped off to prison. I forgot all about getting married after that. I was handcuffed and shackled to several other inmates and taken to a waiting van that had thick mesh wire covering the rear windows and contained 2 wooden benches on either side of the rear loading area where we sat. We rode through the Norfolk Tunnel and into Portsmouth, then headed onto Interstate 264. Midway along the highway, I caught glimpses of Cavalier Manor near Victory Boulevard. It felt creepy riding past my old stomping ground. It was a painful reminder that my life was now controlled by other people. As we rode along and Cavalier Manor faded from view, it dawned on me all over again that it would be years before I passed this way and saw that area again. After 2 hours, the familiar city streets gave way to rural roads. I saw farmland, herds of livestock, and stately houses sitting on rolling hills. It looked like the kind of place where all the people hang big American flags from their front porches. We got to SouthHampton Correctional Center, 80 or so miles from Portsmouth, and were taken to a reception and diagnostic center, a basement facility called the Receiving Unit. A large dormitory lined with about 50 bunk beds on each side of a room. It looked like a bomb shelter inside. The Receiving Unit was a way station for the prison system. Over the course of a month, inmates who came through there were given a battery of psychological tests and physical exams and were classified before being shipped to various prisons throughout Virginia. They were also assigned prison numbers while there. My number was 106383. That number became more important to me than my name. It was used to identify my mail. Guards addressed me by it when calling me to the visiting room, and it was stenciled onto my clothes and stamped into my brain. It became so much a part of my identity that years later, when I got out of prison, I used part of it as a secret computer code at work and have used variations of it for combination locks and bank card codes. Unlike prisoners in the general population at Southampton, who went in and out of their buildings every day, Receiving Unit inmates remained indoors round the clock except at meal times. Each day, we marched single file down the long sidewalks to the cafeteria to eat. Like clockwork, the established Southampton inmates lined up along the sidewalks at our evening mealtime to study us newcomers as we walked past. Some wolves whistled and taunted guys who looked sweet or scared to them. "Yo, hey baby, hey, what's your name? You need some candy or cigarettes? You need somebody to take care of you?" Others looked for friends or relatives they heard were coming through the Receiving Unit. Several times, I spotted homeboys. We acknowledged each other with waves and nods, but we weren't allowed to stop and talk. Every other day or so, a handful of guys were shipped out of the Receiving Unit to other institutions or sent upstairs into the general population at Southampton. Administrators wouldn't tell us in advance where we'd be shipped to serve our time. I wanted to stay at Southampton, where there were lots of homeboys from Portsmouth and Cavalier Manor. Eventually, I got my wish. One morning, my number was called and I was sent upstairs along with several other inmates. On the day I arrived in the yard, a group of the homeboys, Joe Ham, Bonaparte, Feetball, Marvin, Joe Burns, Pearly Blue, Tony Rome, and Chili Bear, were standing around waiting, eager to hear the latest word from the streets. Some of those guys had been locked up for years and had no idea how much the block had changed since they left. Some wanted updates on Scobie D and other well-known hoods ruling the streets. Others asked about girls they dated or wanted to date. Yo man, whatever happened to that big leg gal who lived in Freedom Court? She got knocked up and had a baby. What's that girl named Ramona doing these days? She doing the same old, same old. I hadn't seen her much before I left the street. We talked for hours and caught up on each other's lives. They'd offer to help me adjust in any way they could. Choice food stolen from the kitchen, specially pressed clothes from the laundry. Anything you need, homeboy, just let us know. I went to my cell that evening riding the cloud. The comfort of familiar faces briefly made me forget the circumstances that had brought us together. For a minute there, it felt like homecoming in Cavalier Manor. Except for the ever-present iron bars and a tall barbed wire fence surrounding the place, Southampton vaguely resembled a college campus. It had 5 dormitory buildings, a large cafeteria, an administration building, a canteen, and a chapel, all of which ringed the huge courtyard. My new living quarters were located in a long building, painted in ugly lime green inside, and lined from front to back with jail cells on 2 tiers. I was placed in a second-tier cell about the size of your standard bathroom. It contained a steel bunk with a paper-thin mattress, a small knobless sink, a metal storage cabinet, and a seatless commode placed near the cell door in full view of everybody who walked past. The cell was cramped, but it was mine. After living in dormitories for half a year, I felt like I was at the fucking Waldorf. I cherished my cell for what little privacy it offered. I could retreat there evenings after chow and chill all alone the rest of the night. I noticed that some cats took an almost obsessive pride in their cell homes. They carefully decorated them with matching bathroom towels that they hung over sinks, used to adorn storage cabinets, and draped over cell windows as makeshift curtains. Some inmates got really grand and brought thick, expensive towels and coordinated, rich colors to make their cells look prison plush. You couldn't tell them their cribs weren't laid out. They acted like they lived in posh, high-rise condos instead of stinking jail cells. Watching them made me realize right away how you can lose perspective after being locked up a long time. Inmates lived in 2 types of buildings. There were 3 C buildings, which had cells, and 2 R buildings, which had rooms. Southampton administrators had instituted a behavior modification system where they moved inmates gradually from C1 to more comfortable buildings and granted more privileges as inmates went for stretches of time without getting into trouble. Inmates in C1, where I started, were locked in their cells evenings and let only out to shower. Those who kept a clean record for, say, 4 months were promoted to the C2 building, where they were allowed to play cards, mingle, and watch TV. Most inmates worked to get to the top of the 2R buildings. They got their own room with a key and were granted more freedom to come and go as they please. Advancing from a C to a R building was roughly the equivalent of moving from public housing to the sprawling suburbs. C1 was the wildest building at Southampton. More than half the guys there were old-timers who didn't give a shit about moving up. Some of those cats had so much time to serve that they had no hope of getting out and no incentive to follow rules. They couldn't care less if they got into a fight and made a short-timer miss parole. The hard-nosed among them walked around posturing like they were the baddest niggas in the world, wearing vicious scowls and repeating Southampton's macho credo, "If you ain't no killer, don't fuck with me." That bunch didn't worry me. I knew many of them were fronting, playing crazy nigger roles to keep pressure off themselves. What concerned me most was the cats who were truly insane, like the one inmate who walked around, eyes bulging, staring in the sky, and the many others that had that long gone, far away look. I wonder if one of them, in a fit of blind hysteria, might shank somebody out of the blue. I didn't want to be standing near one of the crazies when he went off. In those first few months in C1, I spent a lot of time taking the pulse of prison life, learning to identify the wolves, the hustlers, the thumpers, the loudmouth bluffs, the thieves, and the few progressive inmates in my building. From my second floor perch, I saw all kinds of transactions among guys handing off contraband and paying off debts with cigarettes and cookies as they passed each other on the first floor. By watching others' mistakes, I also learned some of the do's and don'ts of prison life. Like, don't be seen getting too chummy with administrators. It makes the hustlers paranoid. And don't wear slingshots. That's the prison name for men's briefs. It never occurred to me that there was anything wrong with them until I saw a white inmate, a newcomer like me, walk past my cell on his way to the showers wearing Fruit of the Looms. When everybody started whistling and making catcalls at him, I got the message. Men's briefs are tight-fitting, and anything tight-fitting is an invitation to trouble. I also learned that some prison guards preyed on inmates as much as prisoners preyed on each other. One night, after the lights were turned out, I was reading by the light of the hall lamps. A white prison guard walked quietly to the cell of a known black homosexual, glanced around nervously, then unlocked the door and let the inmate out. He escorted the inmate to the back of the building toward the solitary confinement cells. They remained there a good half hour before the guard returned the inmate to his cell. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what they had done. I spent most of my time reading, writing letters, and memorizing new words. After struggling with Das Kapital by Karl Marx, I realized that my limited vocabulary made me miss the full meaning of much that I read. I decided that whenever I came across an unfamiliar word, I'd stop reading, look it up in a dictionary, memorize it, and use it in a sentence before I resumed reading. I then recorded the new words in a loose-leaf notebook and practiced using them in conversations. It took me months sometimes to get through a single book, but my speed and comprehension got better over time. At some point in my reading, I ran across Rudyard Kipling's poem, If, which was so inspiring to me that I memorized it and recited it as my mantra every day. It's ironic that I got so deep into something written by a person who is widely considered a racist, but the poem has no racist overtones. In fact, it has universal appeal. That poem challenged me to re-examine self-imposed limitations and encouraged me to fight nagging fears that had ruined my life beyond repair. I recited it to myself sometimes after visits from Liz and my son Monroe, who was then 2 years old. I recited it when I felt discouraged or blue. Later, when I got out of prison and went through other hard times working with white folks and trying to find my way, I recited it to help me keep perspective. One of my favorite sections in that poem said, "If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same." I was sitting outside on one of my building stoops, staring across the prison yard one day when two of my homies, Joe Ham and Pearly Blue, came into view about 50 yards away. They bopped down the sidewalk toward the chapel and approached two white inmates standing there. They talked a moment, then Joe Ham hauled off and sucker punched one of the whites in the face. Pearly Blue tackled the guy's partner, and the four of them got into it. Reflexively, I got up and started to run over to jump into it. Then I stopped and reconsidered. In that instant, a bunch of guards ran over and broke up the rumble. They slapped handcuffs on all four inmates and led them away to solitary confinement. The word in the yard was that the fight stemmed from a gang-related beef over the sale of mash, homemade whiskey that some inmates sold. Joe Ham and Pearly Blue were tried by a prison panel and then each placed in a dark isolation cell where inmates were punished for breaking rules. Had I gone over to help them, I would have gotten locked up too and hurt my chances of making first parole. The incident brought home the fact that there was a lot going on at Southampton that I needed to avoid. It made me realize that I needed to figure out where I fit in. Gang rivalries ran deep, and my homies from Cavalier Manor were in the thick of it. They led one of the two largest gangs at Southampton, known as the Tidewater Gang. It was made up of inmates from Portsmouth, Norfolk, Newport News, and Virginia Beach. Its main rival was the Richmond Gang, made up of inmates from Richmond, Virginia's largest city. The Richmond gang members could be recognized by their dark, Ray Charles-like sunshades and black silk stocking caps on their heads. The Tidewater and Richmond gangs each had its own football and basketball teams, a sizable interest in the mash market at Southampton, and a firm handle on drugs, street liquor, and other contraband smuggled into the place. They even competed for control of gay men, whom they called boys, who came to Southampton. There were other, weaker gangs made up of black inmates from smaller locales and gangs of white who banded together for protection. There were more whites at Southampton than in the Norfolk Jail, but still they were the minority. Inmates with no gang ties and those from other states had to fend for themselves. Those who couldn't hold their own standing by themselves got eaten alive, turned into somebody's boy, ripped off, or taken advantage of in some other way. The gang scene posed a dilemma for me. Hanging with my homeboys offered guaranteed backup, which practically every inmate needs to live in peace, but it also made it harder for me to break with the past. Once it became clear what some of my homies were into, I spent less time with them and joined a group of guys who had formed a Christian fellowship. In weekly meetings held in the basement of one building, we read scripture, sang, and talked about God. Some of my homies thought I was faking a religious conversion to try to make parole the first time up, but the spiritual change was very real to me. For the first time in my life, I was consciously involved in an ongoing search to understand the meaning of my existence, and the searching itself gave me a sense of purpose I had never known. It didn't take long for my homies to notice that I distanced myself from them. One day, Pearly Blue came to me and said, "Yo man, why you ain't hanging with the fellas?" I told him, "Hey man, you know I'm trying to move in a different direction. I can't hang out and do that too. That would make me a hypocrite. Nobody don't have a problem with that, do they?" "Nah man, we just noticed that you hang with them Christian dudes and always reading books and shit. That's no problem with us. But you know, other guys in the yard might start thinking maybe you turned to God because you can't handle the time. They think you weak when you get into that Christian bag. You know, this ain't exactly the best place to be turning no other cheek." I saw clearly what Pearly Blue was getting at. He was trying to tell me that I couldn't afford to have my head tucked so high in the clouds that I couldn't watch my back. The environment was full of wolves, looking for weakness to exploit, especially in newcomers. Safety was one concern, but for me, the real issue was allegiance, which I had always felt strongly about. I was torn between old alliances and a new commitment to change. At times, especially on warm, sunny days when all the gangs hung together on the prison yard, it felt awkward not being part of the hometown crowd. Torn between impulses to hang with my homies and break those ties, I played it by ear, hanging with them sometimes and studying the Christian fellowship most of the time. I wrestled with major questions. What if a rumble broke out involving my own town gang? Would I help my homies or stand on the sidelines like I'd done with Pearly Blue and Joe Ham? If I wasn't committed to them, could I expect their help if I got into a beef with a member of another gang? I didn't know how I'd respond in certain situations, and it bothered me sometimes. The prison was actually a large farm. Inmates produced all kinds of vegetables and raised livestock, which was used to feed prisoners at Southampton and at other institutions statewide. Inmates were paid 35 cents daily for their work. I often thought that if I ever got out of prison, I would jump at the chance to work for a minimum wage. Most of my homies had enough seniority to get plum jobs in the laundry, the kitchen, the dental lab. As a new inmate, I was assigned to the gun gang. Each morning, we were taking my truck to pick peas and other vegetables in the vast farm fields. Down on all fours in rows of vegetables, plucking up food in the sweltering heat, I couldn't help wondering what it must have been like for my ancestors to toil like this with no hope of being freed. Always nearby was a symbolic old massa, a white shotgun-toting prison guard. The entire compound seemed like one big plantation. The warden and his assistant were white, as were most of the top administrators. Some things let me know that a number of the whites who worked at SouthHampton had that southern, slave-holding mindset too. I saw it in the way they treated some inmates, especially one dude who worked for me on the gun gang. We called him Heavy. He was tall, fat, and jovial. The cat loved to laugh. He was uneducated, and the white supervisors made fun of him to his face and behind his back. One day, my supervisor called over one of his white friends and said, "Watch this." Then he called Heavy over and said, "Tell us about niggers and flies, Heavy." Heavy smiled broadly and recited, "Niggers and flies I despise. The more I see niggers, the more I like flies." Then my supervisor and the other white man looked at each other in the way that white people communicate with each other with their eyes when blacks are around, and slapped their thighs and laughed, like there was some deeper, private joke between them. Although he was a likable guy, I hated Kevy for being that stupid. I pulled him aside a few times and said, "Man, don't you know they're making fun of you?" He answered, "Man, I ain't worried about them crackers. I just let them think I'm laughing with them. I'm smarter than them." "So what are you getting out of it if you're outsmarting them?" Heavy got serious. "I'm getting the pleasure of laughing at them. Sometimes I want to take my shovel and bust him and our supervisors in the head." I suppose the gun gangs had a meaningful purpose beyond providing us with food, but if there was some deeper value in it, it was lost on me. To me, it was the kind of demeaning, back-breaking labor my stepfather had tried to prepare me for, the very kind I resisted most of my life. It threw me into a serious funk. One day, the farm work got to me so much I rebelled outright. I was in a bad mood, feeling sorry for myself and wondering how much more I could take when my supervisor barked at me several times and said, "Load those feed bags onto that truck." I bent down and tested the weight of the bags, then protested. "These are 100-pound bags. Can't we double up and throw them on the truck?" When he ordered me again to do as he said, I exploded. "I ain't doing it. Slavery is over. I'm sick of this shit." Inmates stopped working and stared. The gun guard stiffened and the supervisor moved closer and squinted his blue eyes threateningly at me. "I'm only going to ask you one more time." I glared back and stood my ground. "I ain't doing it." The supervisor wrote up a complaint and sent me back to the hill, where I was thrown into lockup. When I thought about what I'd done, I realized that in my anger I'd forgotten to apply Mo Battle's principle of consequences, and that one act, I had lost the freedom I had, spoiling my prison record and hurt my chances of making first parole. I got depressed, and then resignation set in. The same resignation that had taken over when I was arrested. It says, "Now you've done it. You've gone too far. You failed to consider consequences. Now it's time to pay." Within a few days, I was taken before a prison panel. I fully expected to be found guilty and placed in isolation, but I got lucky. The supervisor had charged that I refused to work. The panel pointed out that I hadn't refused to work. I simply refused to lift those heavy bags alone. Because of the inaccurate wording in the supervisor's complaint, the panel dropped the charges. I took that ordeal as a sign for God and a warning that I needed to work on my attitude. It made me think of a message I read in the book by Gwendolyn Brooks. When handed a lemon, make lemonade. I decided to try. After returning to the gun gang, I started working harder, doing more than my share, and also doing things without having to be told. Nothing, not even shoveling shit from cow and pig pens, bothered me. I eagerly cleaned the pens and tossed 100-pound feed bags and was the first to jump off the truck when we rode to the fields to herd cattle, repair broken fences, and feed the other livestock. After a while, I discovered that farm work wasn't so bad after you got used to it. I realized that it's your attitude about the work you do that can determine how pleasant or unpleasant it is. For the first time, I understood what my stepfather meant when he said there was dignity in all work. A few times when my stepfather and my mother came to visit me at SouthHampton, I wanted to tell him that I realized. The words formed in my mind, and it seemed they got as far as my throat, but they wouldn't come out. So I held it all in and hoped he knows someday. Not long after the hearing, I was assigned to one of the most prestigious white-collar inmate jobs at SouthHampton, working in the prison library. I thought I died and gone to heaven. Getting that job meant I had access to all the newspapers, periodicals, and books in the library. It meant I didn't have to work under slave conditions in the rain and cold with an armed white man standing over me. It meant I could finally go to work and return in clean clothes. The library was a 2-room building attached to SouthHampton School where inmates studied to get their GEDs. The larger of the 2 rooms was the area where inmates came in after work and on weekends. There, they browsed through the books on the shelves, sat and read newspapers and magazines, or chatted quietly amongst themselves. My job was to keep updated newspapers and periodicals on racks and shelves, to check books in and out, and to keep the place clean. I also led library orientation seminars for new inmates. That helped me on my speaking skills. Most days after doing my chores, I browsed through books and magazines, reading anything that even remotely interested me. I loved being in a place where there were so many books. For once in my life, it made me feel that I had total access to the world. I learned also that being able to find information is as valuable a tool as you'll ever pick up. I discovered how to use reference guides to study anything I wanted. I felt a sense of accomplishment whenever I tracked down some esoteric fact. And my getting the new job demonstrated something that hadn't been so clear before, that education commands respect wherever you go. Compared to most inmates, I was educated, and that distinction benefited me. It helped me get that plum job. The head librarian was a tall white dude named Mr. McCaffrey, a pipe-smoking, easygoing man. He preferred to stay in the back room ordering books and reading rather than hang out front. 2 other inmates worked in the library with me. One was a guy called Hop, a former member of the Black Panther Party who was doing 10 years for armed robbery. Hop was very intellectual. We played chess and often debated whether Christianity was relevant to the black man's struggle for self-determination in America. Hop said Christianity was the white man's tool, another way to keep niggas nonviolent so white folks can keep cracking them over the head. I argued that Christianity, specifically the black church, had always played a role in the black man's struggle, right on up through the civil rights movement. My other library co-worker was a strange acting white guy named Lee Hargrave. He was doing a life sentence in connection with the deaths of several elderly people who died on his shift at the Richmond hospital where he worked. It was one of the most highly publicized murder cases in the history of the state. When Hargrave first got to SouthHampton, a short time after I got there, a rumor spread that he'd be assigned to work in the dispensary. Some inmates threatened to protest. Prison administrators calmed those fears by assigning him to the library. For good reasons, Hargrave was paranoid. He knew he was being closely watched by everybody, inmates and guards alike. Wherever he went out on the yard, inmates stared at him and whispered. He responded by withdrawing as completely as possible from prison life. He never ate in the cafeteria with other inmates. He ate only snacks that he brought from the canteen and food that his parents brought him during Saturday visits. He spent most of his time after work in his cell even when we moved up to other buildings. Hargrave's face was a deathly white, and he wore large, box-shaped glasses. He always had dark rings around his eyes, like he had sleep problems. Although he was heavyset, he had a big waterhead that looked like it belonged on another, bigger body. He constantly bit his fingernails down to stubs. He wore cheap sneakers and always looked nervous, uptight, like he was about to break. Hargrave's arrival at SouthHampton gave me my first sense of the strange pecking order that exists in prison. Under that order, guys serving time for murder and assault command the most respect because their crimes make them seem super bad. Those locked up for robberies and dealing drugs can boast of being hustlers, and they are also admired. But people locked up for crimes such as rape or crimes against the elderly or children are considered weirdos and are sometimes threatened and attacked. Because of the nature of Hargrave's crime, SouthHampton administrators were concerned about his safety. Hargrave came from an upper middle class family that lived in an exclusive Richmond suburb. It was evident that he spent little, if any, time around blacks. When he was assigned to work in the library, he took his time warming the hop in me. I got to know him better after he joined the Christian Fellowship group. Several of us in the group suspected that Hargrave might have joined for more protection from the wolves than out of some deep religious conviction, but we welcomed him anyway. Often, when inmates saw me talking with him, they pulled me aside later and asked, "What's he like, man? Do you think he killed all those people?" Initially, I always told them I thought he was too meek to do something like that. But over time, some things he did changed my mind. Once, after someone broke into his room and stole some of his food, Hargrave laced some of his other food but poison to lay a trap for the thief. I saw then that he was a sickie with a murderous heart. It was the kind of incident that reminded me that I was in a sick place, a place that was to be my home for the next few years. Somehow, I was supposed to live in the midst of all that sickness and come out rehabilitated, healthy. Talk about solutions. It don't get any more messed up than that.